Are men obsolete? That rather in-your-face question was put to 4 women at last Friday's Monk debate in Toronto, up for discussion, that women are not only achieving equality with men, but are fast emerging as the more successful gender of the species. So, even if men are not obsolete, the question of how to be a man in the 21st century remains. What is masculinity today? Let's ask. Michael Reist, he's a recently retired teacher and the author of Raising Boys in a New Kind of World. Adam McPhee, board member of the Canadian Alliance for Equality. Todd Minerson, executive director of the White Ribbon Campaign. Jordan Peterson, clinical psychologist and a professor of psychology at the University of Toronto. And Russell Smith, novelist and columnist for the Globe and Mail. And it's great to have you gentlemen around the table tonight for this discussion. We have no women represented at the table tonight, but they will be represented in video clips. Particularly one of those who participated in last Friday's debate, who is Caitlin Moran, British broadcaster, TV critic, columnist at the Times. Here's a clip of how she thinks of men. We'll get that started, then come back and chat. Roll tape, please.
One of the questions that I'm asked when I tell people that I'm a feminist, indeed a strident feminist, is, do you hate men? Of course the answer here is no. Of course I don't. I'm related to many men. I'm friends with many men. I've married one of them. The Beatles were all men. I like men. However, it seems to me that after 100,000 years of the patriarchy, men could do with a little rest. Why don't you sit down, take the load off your legs for a while, maybe read the sports section, let the ladies take over the world for a while, and then, in a bit, when you've got your energy back, we can all rule the world together.
Okay. Todd, you first on this. Obviously, I think she means to be funny in the way she says that, but what do you think of the notion that she's actually putting forward that, hey guys, why don't you just hit the sidelines for a while and let somebody else take a turn at running the world?
Well, there is no doubt that men's lives are changing, right? And patriarchy is in a state of flux right now. I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. And I don't think it's a bad thing for men either, because there are costs that come to those kinds of pressures for men as well. Like? And costs of being a provider and protector, of trying to meet these impossible standards in life about boys don't cry, you have to be strong, all of these types of things.
But the costs, you mean more heart attacks, shorter lifespans?
Shorter lifespans, overrepresented in prisons. These things are not good for men either. And I think actually, joking aside at the end there, when we do realize that we are moving towards a more equitable society, that gives us all a chance to be participants in the world in more human forms, not masculine, not feminine forms, but more human forms.
Adam, what did you think when you saw the clip?
My concern would be, what does she think our role from the sidelines would be? Is she thinking we should be sidelined in the way that women were historically sidelined, in which case that's not getting to any level of equality, which is what feminism always says it strives for. So to sideline an entire gender is to do what feminism has been trying to fight for generations now.
What if, Michael, we took her up on the offer and hit the sidelines for a while and let women run the world? What do you think?
There would continue to be an imbalance, because women would still, I feel that the feminism we're faced with today mimics patriarchy. And when feminism began, I hoped for something new. And what worries me is that a lot of the discourse of feminism is really copying the discourse of patriarchy. And the dialogue is always framed in terms of either or. Who's going to rule? Who's going to be on top of the pyramid? And you guys have been at the top. Now it's time for us to be at the top. And we've got to find another metaphor, another paradigm for gender relations other than this competitive one, where one has to rule over the other. And this is the new phase in history that we're entering.
Well, just before I give you two guys a shot at this, let's put some numbers up here, which admittedly, we present with a little bit of a smile, but let's try this anyway. What if men stayed home? These are all figures from the United States, incidentally. Well, we'd have no electricity, because 99% of power plant operators, distributors, and dispatchers are men. 91% of electrical engineers are men. 97% of electrical power line installers are men. We'd have no clean water to drink, because 95% of water and liquid waste treatment plant operators are men. We wouldn't be able to take planes or trains, because 96% of aircraft pilots and flight engineers are men, 98% of aircraft mechanics and service technicians are men, and 100% of locomotive engineers and operators are men. There would be no law, order, or safety, we say with tongue-in-cheek. 87% of cops are men, 97% of firefighters are men, 93% of garbage collectors are men. Okay, Jordan, obviously our society would come to a crashing and grinding halt if all of the men who do those jobs for too long decided to stay on the sidelines. So what do we think about all this?
Well, one of the clearest distinctions between men and women that's emerged in the scientific literature is the difference between male and female patterns of interests. And the researchers who study this call it the person versus thing orientation. And women are much more oriented towards people-related careers than men on average, and men are much more oriented towards thing-oriented careers. And so part of this is a reflection of what appear to be innate differences in interest. You can see them in chimpanzees, for example, and in the more egalitarian societies like the Scandinavian countries, the interest gaps are larger rather than smaller. So this, to me, this comes as no real surprise. I mean, some of those jobs also require a fair bit of upper body strength, but a lot of it is thing orientation. And that's also associated with some personality differences.
Okay, but Russell, the notion that if men decided to hit the sidelines, none of these things would get done, I mean, you have to kind of smile when you say that, right? Women would just take these jobs if we decided not to do them.
We know that they would, and we know, too, that throughout history we've been saying they've been incapable of doing all kinds of jobs that men are innately better qualified to do, such as running countries and militaries, and we know that when given those opportunities, they run them very much the way men do. I have terrible mistrust of any science that claims to show innate differences between men and women, simply not just because of hundreds of millennia of conditioning of the subjects, but of the scientists themselves, of the people making these studies. I mean, that we know there are differences in practice between men and women. That the deep rabbit hole of trying to prove that they're innate or biological seems to me to be we'll never reach a conclusion, and I don't know if it's really profitable.
I think the guy beside you wants to go down that rabbit hole. Go ahead, Jordan.
Well, you just don't get to say things like that. There's lots of things that are provable in one way or another and testable. I mean, the clear hypothesis for cultural conditioning, it's an absolutely crystal clear hypothesis, which is that as you make your societies more egalitarian, the size of the differences between men and women shrink. That is not what's happened. What's happened in the Scandinavian countries, which were arguably the most egalitarian countries in the world, is that the more egalitarian the society becomes, the larger the gender differences become. It's as clear a contradiction of the cultural conditioning.
How does that prove innate biological differences in interests? How does that prove it?
They're either cultural or they're biological.
But how does the I'm not sure why you're making the link that if there is a change in equality, that proves a biological difference. I don't understand that.
What's the alternative? There's either a cultural difference or a biological difference, or there's a third factor that no one's identified. So that's it. Those are the options you've got. Mm-hmm. And it's a clear prediction. And you have to also admit that if we would go back 20 years and we would make a prediction from the cultural perspective, we would say, as we move towards equality in law, equality in opportunity, and equality in outcome, the gender differences disappear because they're cultural artifacts. That's exactly the opposite of what's happened.
And where would you go with this? What do you want to see happen because of this knowledge that you have?
Well, one thing I would like to have happen is that I would like people to stop talking about pure cultural production of gender differences. It's absolute nonsense. It's as bad as teaching that the world is flat.
We're going to get Michael and then
again,
and then Todd to break the tie here.
Again, the discourse devolves into either-or thinking. We are the product of hundreds of thousands of years of evolution. Evolutionary biologists, evolutionary psychologists made it clear that there are fundamental differences between the male and the female brains. In addition to that, gender is culturally determined. Gender is culturally defined. And it's, again, not a question of either-or. So the people who talk about evolution, they sound deterministic. This is what men are, this is what women are, and there's nothing you can do about it. On the other end of the spectrum, you have people who talk about how it's totally constructed, gender, with no reference at all to our innate brain differences. And I think an intelligent discussion about gender has to acknowledge both ends of that spectrum, biology and social conditioning.
Todd, you want to weigh in?
I think, Michael's getting more to the complexity and the nuance of the situation. In the same way Russell pointed out, women weren't allowed to access a lot of those kinds of jobs for the last hundreds of years. So it's no doubt that there's 100% of male locomotive drivers in that particular study that you're talking about. But the thing that we also have to start to consider is what kinds of jobs are men, through these social ideas of masculinity, not permitted to, not able to follow. And we look at areas like caregiving, we look at areas like teaching, we look at areas like early childhood education. I have a friend who took his 3-year-old to day school, a preschool course, and there was a male early childhood educator there. And he overheard another parent saying, "Hey, that guy's not going to change my kid's diaper, is he?" And we all know what the assumptions were around that. So this is the way that these ideas around modern masculinity are also killing us as men.
Adam, there's still, well, you tell me, do you think there's still a kind of an eyebrow-raising moment when a man says, "I want to go to school and learn how to become a nurse"?
Well, I'm a social worker, so I went to Ryerson for social work, and there was about a class difference of 300 women to 10 men, one of which was Jeff Perra of the White Ribbon Campaign, and so I see a lot of difference. And so if we talk about flipping the script, like whether it's innate differences or cultural differences, there are differences between men and women. So if men were to take the sideline role that women have had for years, would we also flip that script and see women doing electrical work, firefighting? Would men then be the social workers? Would we be the teachers? Would we be the caregivers? Is that considered the sideline roles, and would we take those on as well?
Russell, let me put this quote to you, because Maureen Dowd from the New York Times was another one of the participants in last Friday's Monk debate, and she writes, "So now that women don't need men to reproduce and refinance, the question is, will we keep you around? And the answer is, we need you in the way that we need ice cream. You'll be more ornamental." You're laughing, but are you content to be seen as mere ornamental?
I'm not worried about it. I see it in my own social life and in all the media that I consume, a constant yearning among women for conventional relationships. I've been reading for the past 10 years dozens and dozens of dating blogs. I don't know if you guys are obsessed with dating blogs as I am, but I find it really fascinating. They're all about the inadequacies of dating, the inadequacies of the permissive society and the permissive sexual culture, and a yearning for conventional domestic relationships. They're yearning for conventional men. I think in a sense that's what Sex and the City was all about. I don't think it was all about sex. It was all about the inadequacies of sexual culture. And it was about a longing for very conventional relationships.
There's something to be said for solid.
Well, and men playing very conventional roles. If you look at personal ads looking for partners, women are looking for men who are, number one, tall, you'll be pleased to know, but secondly, solvent. I mean, they want men who are employed, and we know subjectively that those men are more attractive. So I don't see those ideas reflected in contemporary society.
Hannah Rosen, another one of the Monk panelists, author of the book End of Men, asks, what if modern post-industrial society is simply better suited to women? Jordan, your reaction to that?
Well, some of the more academic pursuits might be more suited to women specifically. Because they don't require as much sort of brute strength and they don't require as much interest in things. But it depends on which level of society you're looking at. As you pointed out already with your statistics, if you look at working jobs, essentially, men do almost all of them, especially if they're dangerous. Mm-hmm. And the probability that that's going to change is low. It hasn't changed much since the 1950s. There's another thing I wanted to mention too. We seem to be implicitly accepting the idea of previous patriarchy and the idea that men had not let women do things. It's like, I don't buy that argument a bit. I think the reason that all of this is happening right now is because the birth control pill was invented in the 1960s, and that gave the female gender of one species complete control over its reproductive function for the first time in biological history. And this is the aftermath of that. The reason women weren't doing some of the things men were doing, believe me, they were working. They weren't doing some of the things men were doing was because the whole biological structure of society was radically different. And we can't go back and say, well, all those men who came before us were like forbidding women to take their proper role. It's like, that's just not a reasonable historical analysis.
Russell, you buy that?
Oh yeah, sure. I'm sure that's a factor. The fact remains we are now where we are now, whatever has caused it. I find that I wonder when we insist on talking about what could masculinity be and what could femininity be, I find those unuseful concepts. Usually when we talk about what are desirable masculine values, we talk about values that could be easily attained by people of either sex. So they just seem to be generally desirable values to me. So I don't find a discussion of what is a good kind of masculinity very useful. I think it would be more useful to talk about what would be a good kind of person.
Okay, fair enough, but humor us for a little while longer anyway during the course of the hour here. Let me just follow up one more thing here with Todd, which is, are the skills that you need to handle the transition to the 21st century, which we're now obviously in the midst of, are they more likely found in women or men? Because the recession that we've just gone through, they didn't call it the he session for nothing. Men disproportionately suffered because a lot of those jobs that require the strength and to do all the things that we've been talking about are mostly done by men, and they mostly face the layoffs. Maybe it's better to be a woman at the dawn of the 21st century because it's more in line for you.
Yeah, I think we saw an adjustment in kind of male-dominated professions and industries, but I think what we also forget in that picture is that the jobs that survived and that were mostly dominated by women were insecure service sector kinds of related jobs that aren't so hot themselves. So, you know, there's a massive kind of readjustment happening in the economic world and in the world of work that is a part of this conversation. What I think we are missing talking about is what are the opportunities for us now as men with this changing world, with this potentially this reduction of pressure around being a protector and a provider. What are some things that we can explore in our lives, in our families, in our emotions that we haven't done?
You're not going to be surprised. I'm not going to let you go there just yet because we still have some more death and destruction to discuss here. A discussion with a group of fourth grade male students resulted in these points being made about what it's like being a boy today. You're all giving me these looks like I know what you're about to say. What I don't like about being a boy, here we go. Not being able to be a mother, not supposed to cry, not allowed to be a cheerleader, supposed to do all the work, supposed to like violence, supposed to play football. Boys smell bad. Having an automatic bad reputation and growing hair everywhere. That's what I don't like about being a boy, said some of those grade 4s who were surveyed on this. Okay, this is right out of your white ribbon campaign. What do you make of these reactions?
Well, this is some work we did with some grade 4 boys, and we asked them not only questions about what they didn't like about being a boy, but what they did like about being a boy. And we wanted to get to the impressions at a 9-year-old age, if they understand what some of these pressures and expectations are. And the first one that came on that list was, I can't be a mother. And we talked to this boy after. We said, can you tell us a bit more about that? What do you mean by that? And it wasn't womb envy. It wasn't that he was, you know, he wanted to carry a child and give birth and this. But he said to us, you know, when I watch TV and I see commercials on TV and I see all these shows, it's always the mom that takes care of the kids. He thought that that was inaccessible to him as a 9-year-old boy in his future in front of him.
So nurturing is not part of fatherhood.
Caring is not only not part of fatherhood, but it's women's work. It's a woman's job.
Interesting.
And so, you know, this was very revealing to us. The other things on that list all, you know, were shocking that a 9-year-old boy could already articulate, or a group of 9-year-old boys could articulate what some of these pressures and expectations are.
Let me get Adam then Jordan on this same thing.
I read that article as well. It came on the tails of me making a realization that when I went to grade school, I didn't have a male role model as a teacher until grade 5. So for those grade 4 students, if that had been me when I was in grade 4 being asked that, I had not yet had a male teacher. I was in a traditional family where my father was working and he wouldn't come home until 6, where he would be trying to unwind from work. So he'd want to read the newspaper. He wouldn't want to listen to us watching whatever TV show we were watching. And so those male role models are kind of distant. And so that's one reason why I would like to see more male teachers in schools, because these kids don't have positive male role models where they can be more nurturing like mothers.
But just so I'm clear, those male teachers tend to come later in the game, and so at this stage of the game, you're not surprised that this is what you get.
The only male role model I had was the principal, who you're sent to when you're being disciplined, when you're in trouble, who you don't want to go see.
You don't want to see him. Okay, Jordan?
Well, you were mentioning the role of TV in establishing roles. Well, back in the early 60s, there were lots of shows that had positive male role models. My Three Sons, Father Knows Best, that's 2 of them.
Leave It to
you
Beaver.
can't even imagine a show like Father Knows Best now. It just wouldn't be possible.
No, most of the men, father is the idiot in today's
exactly.
sitcoms.
That's exactly right. Most of the time when you see men, especially in a familial role on TV, they're They're completely and laughably incompetent, and that's okay for some reason. Now, I don't care really one way or another, but although at some level I guess I think it's appalling, but it's a reflective of this switch in cultural attitudes towards men. And if, to the degree that boys are watching TV, if they think that's the role that men have in a family, it's no wonder they don't want it.
Michael
Who would
and Russell.
want that?
Yeah, I worked with boys for 30 years in the classroom, and the number one issue I saw was the absence of positive male role models. And with that, the absence of initiation rituals. We are raising a generation of boys who are on hold, who never become men. And I mentioned Rob Ford. For me, Rob Ford is the best example we have in right now of the undeveloped male, the uninitiated male. His behavior is very much the behavior of a grade 7 or 8 student. And that is what boys see when they look around the culture. They see men who are boys. And what they need are men who've become men, who've done the work.
What stunts?
Pardon me?
What stunts that growth?
The absence of male role models. They say girls become women, boys are made into men. And I think there's a lot of truth in that.
If you want them to be made into men.
If you want them to be made into men.
Yes.
And the thing I lament is the absence of older males who step up and play that role. I see men absenting themselves from boys' lives. How many boys do we know raised by single mothers? The father is lurking somewhere, who knows where. And I just see so many examples of men not playing a role in boys' lives. The only place in Canadian culture where it's acceptable for men and boys to be together is on the hockey rink. And I go back to what you were saying about the man who is nurturing, suspicion of the man who is nurturing. And again, in the teaching profession, I'm teaching high school, more men, but in elementary school, very few men. And they have told me over and over again that it's fear of association, fear of suspicion.
I don't want to turn this into another Rob Ford program, but since you said it was the absence of a positive male role model early in life that may have stunted this growth, neither one of you or I know him very well, but he always talks about how his father, who was also a politician, was the singular influence in his life. So how does that
I think it's just the absence of role models, though. I think there's other pieces to it, right? There's these social constructions of masculinity that we force boys into at a very early age, that this idea that you can't seek help, you're weaker than if you do ask for help, you tough it out, you rub a little dirt on it, you don't cry. These kinds of things also have a tremendous impact on how men make choices around help-seeking behaviors, around healthy and behaviors and choosing risk-averse behaviors. All of these things come into play in addition to not having.
Russell, I haven't heard from you yet on this.
I was going to, just to get back to your fourth graders complaining about the pressures of maleness being put on them. I just want to point out that this lamenting the angst that men face facing the pressures of masculinity is not at all new to the 20th century. Some of the greatest chroniclers of masculinity and macho have, in artistic history certainly, have addressed the angst and insecurity of men. And I'm thinking specifically of writers like Hemingway. Hemingway's usually called a macho writer, and he writes about men feeling a great deal of fear and stress at the idea of being called a coward, at the idea of entering into a violent situation, at the idea of not being a man in the most traditional way. They're deeply tortured and insecure men. So I just wanted to point out that this is true of any chronicler of the masculine throughout history. So it's not necessarily a 21st century problem. This issue of the men we see in the TV sitcoms, this is new and this is weird. This is weird. The dads and the guys who, American culture in particular tells us that the idea of being a really typical guy's guy is to be deeply crude and insensitive. I think it's interesting to point out that these anyone who might think that this is somehow a result of feminism or equality is wrong, because these shows are made by men. Mm-hmm. These are views of men that men like to propagate about ourselves. We're getting a little bit more philistinic about what defines a man in popular culture.
One hopeful male role model I see on the media landscape is Sheldon in Big Bang Theory. And I work with a lot of kids, a lot of boys, and they love Sheldon. And the reason they love
Just
Sheldon...
for those who haven't seen the show?
You might call him autistic. He's at the autistic end of the spectrum. He's a PhD in theoretical physics, and it's a situation comedy where he's living with his roommates, and it's a wonderful show, very, very funny. But he is unique in media in that he is extremely brilliant. He satisfies very few gender role stereotypes for the male, but he is very lovable, and I would even say loving in his own particular way. But what's interesting to me anecdotally is how the range of kids who love him and look to him as a role model, that it's okay to be sensitive, it's okay to be articulate, it's okay, keyword, to be smart. And in the rest of the culture, men are stupid and men are irresponsible. And I thank God for Sheldon. One of the problems you see with Big Bang Theory in recent seasons is that they're moving more and more toward sex, and that just becomes the whole, raison d'etre of the show. That's too bad. But in the early episodes, it celebrated a smart guy.
I want to show some more tape, but before I do that, I do want a little personal follow-up from you if I can. Your son is how old?
4.
He's 4. If he comes to you someday and says, Daddy, I want to be a cheerleader, can I be? What do you say to him?
Well, of course, why not? Why would I? What kind of insensitive guy do you think I am?
But when you think of cheerleaders now, you think of Dallas Cowboys cheerleaders, that kind of thing. You don't think of the acrobatics
Right.
and like you would have seen in college.
Right.
So what do you tell him?
Hey, I keep trying to tell him against gender. I'm against the ideas of gender.
It's a good place to meet girls. Okay, Jordan, didn't think of it that way.
The President of the United States, who was a cheerleader.
Who's that?
George Bush.
Which one?
The second one, the sequel.
W was a cheerleader?
He was a former cheerleader.
I didn't know that. Okay. Let's continue to explore how some grown men think about what it means to be male in today's culture. And this is from a Wojtek, you produced this documentary, didn't you? Yes, you did. This aired on the previous program we did here called Studio 2, 14 years ago, I think. And, well, it speaks for itself. Let's roll the tape, please.
There's this dance going on, and unfortunately, women have only recognized the male part of the dance because that's the one that they're focused on. And we've got to inform the whole of society about the female part of the dance.
We often talk about the female as being a sex object, but then the male as being a success object. In my experience, what happened was I felt my ex-wife, wanted to trade up. All of a sudden, she had achieved equality with me. And now it was like, well, I'm not so sure I'm happy with equality, and what I really need now is to move up and to get a man who's richer, who's better educated. Most men would feel more comfortable or more able to express ourselves if there weren't so many fixed ideas about what we're supposed to be. Now, I think for a lot of men, we're used to that, and we don't really feel that it's a liability, the fact that we're expected to support a family, take the brunt of that, and if there's a noise in the house, we have to be the ones to go downstairs and risk death if it's an armed intruder, and the fact that we're the ones that are expected to go off and fight in the military and potentially die.
Let's just, Jordan, pick up on the last point, the notion that men are disproportionately expected to expose themselves to danger. Still the case today?
Sure. Yeah.
No argument there.
No.
Is it right?
I think it's okay.
Because?
Well, I could talk about it biologically, I suppose, to some degree. In most species, males are more expendable. It's because each woman is capable and generally does produce at least one child, but many men don't. And so you see this across all sorts of different species. But there's more to it than that. Like, I haven't heard any voices raised here today so far sort of talking about the advantages to the classical male roles. I mean, I don't exactly see what's wrong with them. When I think of a positive male role model, I don't really think of nurturing. I mean, not in the female sense. I think that a good male role model teaches you literally how to stand up and control yourself. And some of that isn't nurturing. I don't want nurturing, particularly from my friends. I'd rather have comedy. And some of that can be really rough.
Okay, but you would not want to be disqualified from being able to be a nurturer just because you're male, presumably.
Well, it depends on what you mean by being a nurturer. Like when I had children, when my wife had children, and I did, we divided up the roles in a way that seemed to work quite well. And the way it seemed to work out was, and because I was also kind of worried about infants, because what the hell do I know about infants? She took care of the little kids and I took care of her. And that was a good deal. And then when the kids got a little older, which would be 2 or 3, I was, playing with them nonstop, pushing them around and bouncing them around and stretching them out and making them have, extending the range of their experience and harassing them into, attentive consciousness.
And that worked?
Well, they seem to be reasonably awake for approximately 20-year-old kids. And men do a lot of playing with their kids, and we underestimate the importance of play. Rough and tumble play, for example, is part of what makes kids civilized, and men do a lot of that.
Adam, where do you stand on the issue of courage as a masculine virtue?
I see it as a expected perspective on men. Like, I've got a couple students. One of my now colleagues at work, who was a former student, every day she has to walk to Queen and Sherbourne, which is one of the worst intersections of Toronto, and it's often expected of me to walk her. She knows she can do it on her own, and I'd rather not see it as I'm expected to walk her to protect her. It's, hey, let's go together so we can protect each other, because for being assaulted on the street, I find men are more likely to be assaulted. Domestic violence may be more of a realm for women, but when I look at the history of violent incidents that have happened in that area, it's typically to men. There was a 2-week period where 3 men on different occasions in just a 2-week period were assaulted at that intersection. And so if anything, I feel she should be jumping in front of me because she's less likely to be hit by anyone down in that area.
Statistically speaking, a woman is less likely to be harmed there than a man.
Because they're more likely to say, wait, I'm not going to hit a woman, but they'll fight me on her behalf.
Russell, the idea of courage as a masculine virtue, what do you think?
Well, I mean, I can't wait for Jordan to leap in and tell me there's a scientific study proving that men are more courageous than women. Our daily lives prove to us that that's not the case, that women in our daily lives, in all of our life experience, shows us that women are just as courageous as men in various different ways. And when women are given situations of authority, such as the leadership of countries, they're no less warlike than men throughout human history. So Jordan, tell me, what does the study?
I mean, even with the studies that I was discussing previously, and there were some objections to that, being that, if all the men weren't around doing things, women would step in and do them, and that's certainly possible. That doesn't necessarily mean that they would want to do them. And part of whatever in the world gender equality might be seems to me also to be allowing people the maximum degree of free choice that's commensurate with a civilized society. And the choices could easily be radically different between men and women. The evidence seems to suggest that that would be the case, but I wouldn't say that we have, heard the last word on it. Courage, that's a tough one. I'm not exactly sure what it means. You have to be very careful in defining things like that before you can discuss things like gender differences.
Well, let's, Michael, look at the flip side. Do you think men are more inclined than women to engage in what you might refer to as riskier behavior?
I think, again, the research tells us that it's true that biologically, through evolutionary history, we have evolved to be more the risk takers. But on the topic of courage, I do believe that it is a human attribute. I think Jordan and myself, we come from a generation that has one foot in two worlds. We have one foot in the old patriarchal world. We remember Leave It to Beaver and all these shows that you mentioned. But kids growing up today, they don't know what you're talking about when you mention My Three Sons, Leave It to Beaver and all those shows. I think boys today are growing up in a very different world, and for them, this egalitarian ethos will be more the norm. And I think you really have to consider who you're listening to when you're having the gender debate, because if you're talking to somebody who knew what patriarchy was and kind of loved it, then you're going to get a particular slant. But I think boys today, we're also talking about the Industrial Revolution, and boys, how they're not hands-on, and they're not going to, there are going to be no jobs for them, the jobless recession for men. I find boys in school, you ask them, do you want to work with your hands? They don't want to work with their hands. They want to work at a screen. I think that the generation that's coming up, this crisis of the post-industrial society, is not as great as we think it is. And I think many males will be quite happy to be in the helping professions or to be at a screen, but they won't have to be on an assembly line or at a forge and this kind of thing.
No, but Jordan's point was that women are more likely to interact with people, whereas men are more likely to interact with things.
And this is where we go back to determinism versus do we have free will? Are we changeable? And people can change, and societies change. And I think in the future we will have a much more egalitarian society. I feel it's inevitable. We're moving toward that.
Okay, let me read something here. This was the documentary we just saw a clip from that Vodek did back in 1999. We put that online, and then we got some comments to it, and I want to read an excerpt of one of the comments that we got here. It goes like this: so-called men's rights activism is all too often a sheep's cloak apologia for those already with an overabundance of privilege, male, white, hetero, who gleefully engage in sexist attitudes and speech that supports rape culture, dehumanization, and inequality of women by disgustingly graphic threats of rape and violence, all the while hidden within the typically cowardly anonymous mass of the mob in the internet. The MRA, men's rights activists, types, wail and moan without even a hint of irony or self-awareness about their supposed victimhood, which is actually only a very slight and hard-won correction in their entitlement to total societal dominance, vicious behavior, and thoughtless derision of anyone who does not share the same arbitrary accident of birth. The note was signed O. Don't know if it's a male or female, but take your guesses. Adam, how about you on this? I gather the idea of men's rights has been a highly controversial thing since that documentary was made nearly a decade and a half ago, and I wonder why.
Well, Vodek emailed that page to me, and I saw that comment myself, and I commented on it, where Bell Hooks, who's one of the most famous feminists, commented on how white women had hijacked feminism and was preaching about how these white women were preaching their own needs and kind of minimalizing women of color. And so that was something that I saw, where to say people interested in men's rights are all white male, able-bodied, all kinds of privilege, which I embody myself, that feminism hasn't done that, but feminism has done that. And I acknowledge we're at a very white panel here today. And there's something I often bring up when instances of color are mentioned, where I talk about, say, black men's issues, and I'm often told, well, that's because they're black. But if it was because they're black, then black women would suffer the exact same problems because they're both black. But
they don't.
Black men are more likely to have what happened to Trayvon Martin, where he's shot for wearing a hoodie and carrying some Skittles. But black women are more likely to be trying to adapt to more white ideas of beauty, where they're straightening their hair, lightening their skin. And so there's different things where there's the intersectionality of being male and black, and it's not just their blackness.
Todd, this notion, though, that you five, presumably heterosexual, although I don't know, white males ought to just shut up because you're in a position of privilege? What do you think?
I think we have to be really careful in these kinds of conversations, right? Because on the one hand, we must acknowledge the privilege and power that men have in our society. If we look at electoral representation, if we look at income distribution, if we look at violence and based on gender, and if we look at sexual reproductive rights, faith, leadership in faith communities, could go on. Men do have a tremendous amount of power and privilege. And that does cause a lot of harm to a lot of different people, particularly women and girls. But we have to really also acknowledge it does harm men and boys as well. Men can be victims of domestic violence. Anybody who's a victim of domestic violence or any kind of violence deserves support, treatment, caring, all of those things in their lives. Where the problem, I think, becomes is a point I think that Russell mentioned earlier. I don't think these things are attributable to feminism or to equality. Men were really good at killing each other for hundreds of thousands of years before the feminist waves came around. So what we have to understand is that these are the ways in which this male-dominated patriarchal society is actually killing us as men and boys as well. And a move towards greater equality will actually help us reduce the amount of violence against men, open up men to seeking help, to accessing more kinds of professions, to being more open to being smart, to doing those types of things in their lives.
Jordan.
I don't think that the typical feminist, say, like Hannah Rosen, wants equality at all. I mean, first of all, if you look at the very bottom of the dominance hierarchies, say, in Western society, the people who are the worst off are men, the ones at the bottom. So there's nothing more lacking. There's no group of people for whom there is less sympathy than down and out men. Like, men don't have much sympathy for them, and women have, as far as I can tell, virtually none. The equality is always aimed at the top. Like, men certainly are very dominant at the top of most professions, but it's a very small number of men. It's also a very small number of professions. And the equality that's talked about is always the women who are in the middle getting to the most powerful positions that men occupy. It has nothing to do, say, with bringing the 30% of men or 25% of men who are barely clinging to the edge of existence up into some, quasi-civilized form of life. They're just ignored. There's nothing more contemptible, generally speaking, than a failed man. And that's not in the conversation at all. So, and men don't have the power. Some men have the power. And there aren't very many of them. And that's because power is not distributed normally.
So let's not generalize about white heterosexual men.
Well,
because some of them are down at the bottom.
Well, we also might point out that some of them actually deserve their positions of so-called power and privilege. They invent things, and they invent things that are really useful. Most billionaires, for example, now are self-made, most of them. Well, try being a billionaire and see how easy that is. So,
men who are hostile to feminism, I feel that hostility is rooted in fear and anger. And the fear is related to fear of loss of control. And I want to bring in video games because, again, I work with youth, and I don't think we really realize the size of the video game world in cyberspace and how so many young guys live in cyberspace. And boys have said to me that video games are a fantasy of male power. And the issue of boys who are over-feminized, boys who are taught by female teachers, raised by mother, living in a feminized environment, they want some kind of sense of power and control of their lives, and they're moving to cyberspace to get it. A little bit in sports, more so in the United States, but I would say those are the two places where males are looking for power and control because they feel they've lost power and control. And again, the question becomes then, how are we going to work this imbalance out?
Jordan.
Well, one of the things that's kind of cool about those video games, I've played first-person shooter games with my son, and he just wipes me out. It's really embarrassing, and it makes him laugh a lot, is that there can be really, really harsh competition in those games. And one thing I've noticed, and this is like a dirty little secret of academia, I think, is that if I'm in a mixed gender discussion group, I have to basically remove about 90% of myself. Because if I was who I am, and as harsh as I am, and as forthright as I actually am, the discussion wouldn't even get off the ground. I have to rein myself in and be so polite. I mean, it's true with many men, too, that I have to be that. But with some men, it isn't. But with the women I've worked with, politeness trumps truth.
Politeness trumps truth.
You bet. And one of the things I think that men are really good at is saying harsh truths. And when you say harsh truths, you're not actually all that interested in people's feelings.
But they're not saying a harsh truth to arrive at truth. They're saying a harsh truth to win the debate.
That's a different thing.
Competition is fundamental to the male psyche. And when you get a group of men around a table, the unspoken agenda is who's going to come out on top. And that's very common among males. And it's very destructive. And I think that's one of the things that women have to offer.
Why is it destructive?
Because that's not how you arrive at truth.
But guys, I don't
you arrive at
this
truth
at all.
through consensus.
I don't experience this gender distinction you're describing at all.
Maybe you're not as harsh as me.
I think we have different friends, perhaps, but I find that the women I argue with just as intimidating and just as forthright. And these are generalizations about gender that I haven't seen in existence since my parents' generation.
Just as competitive?
Yes, just as competitive, just as desirous to win the argument. Yeah, yeah. And I find I'm often the one stressing a need for politeness and a reining in of tone. And particularly now with my feminist acquaintances and colleagues, there does seem to have been a ramping up of angry rhetoric in the last 10 years, I've noticed. I'm not sure why it's happened. But I find that the tone is much more forthright than even I am used to or comfortable with. So.
We heard Maureen Dowd earlier. Let's hear from another New York Times columnist now. Here's David Brooks talking about diversity in schools. He writes, schools have to engage people as they are. That requires leaders who insist on more cultural diversity in school, not just teachers who celebrate cooperation, but other teachers who celebrate competition. Not just teachers who honor environmental virtues, but teachers who honor military virtues. Not just curriculums that teach how to share, but curriculums that teach how to win and how to lose. Not just programs that work like friendship circles, but programs that work like boot camp. David Brooks, Michael doesn't call it this, but he is talking about gender differences here, isn't he?
Well, that's a hard quote to respond to, again, because I can think of boys who would find that kind of environment soul-killing. I can think of girls who would say, hey, that sounds kind of interesting. So this is not a gender issue. This is an attitude toward reality. What he's describing is the spectrum of attitudes toward reality. Is reality something is the world something you conquer, destroy, and dominate? Or is the world a place of conciliation? And there's a subtext in there too of kind of mocking the conciliatory approach, kind of degrading, demeaning the consensus and togetherness.
Friendship circles.
Friendship circles, right. And it's said tongue-in-cheek, and it's said in a derogatory way, and that's not helpful.
Todd, then Jordan.
One of the things that we have to acknowledge is that the gendered constructions that are put on those values, on those terms, are a big part of the problem. I mean, earlier to that idea of courage, is it a masculine attribute? I mean, what is courage? Standing up in a battlefield, being close to Remembrance Day and remembering some of the things my grandfather shared about his war experience. Sure, that's courage. What about the single mom who works 3 jobs and tries to get through life and provide the very best for her kids?
Courage
That's
of a
a
different
heck of a lot of courage
Absolutely.
too, right? But we focused in on the gendered notion of that. I think in the same way, though, all of those things are so loaded that we have to get beyond them being attached to gendered identities and gendered constructions and move them into human capacities, human values, acknowledging difference. Equality is about saying, hey, we all have an opportunity to do this. We all might be very different. We might have different needs, and we got to work to accommodate those.
Jordan.
So the developmental psychologist Piaget was very interested in the emergence of morality. And he was a real genius. And one of the things he pointed out was that there was nothing more civilized than a competitive game. And the reason for that was that, first, there were stakes worth fighting for. So it was actually about something valuable. Second, if you're competing with someone in a game, you both have to accept the rules and stay within them. And that's really as far as Piaget was concerned, the ability to play games like that laid the groundwork for functioning in a civilized society. If you have a variety of people in an organization or in something that's trying to become an organization and they're pursuing limited resources, the only way to do that without devolving into war is by playing a competitive game. And the idea that there's something wrong with competition innately it's an unbelievably destructive idea. Plus, it's also ignorant.
Competition is a good thing. But I'd like to quote J.D. Salinger, Catcher in the Rye, where when Holden goes to his teacher, the teacher says, life's a game, boy, you got to learn to play the game. And Holden says, it's a game for people for whom it works. But there are a lot of people for whom the game does not work. So yes, game theory, game archetype works in a lot of situations. But the question is, what's the game? And where is the game heading?
Game.
Yeah, but a lot of games are destructive,
Well, I'm not so sure about that. Like, what games are destructive?
War is a destructive game.
It's not a game.
It has the qualities of a game.
It has some of the qualities of a game.
That's why boys love the
Except that
first
people die.
game. Mm-hmm.
Thus, it's not a game.
But
in a game, people don't die, and they also don't get hurt.
But again, in a war, you would ask yourself, what's the outcome we're trying to achieve here? And I think we've all lived through some wars in the last generation or two where we've said, this is a questionable game. More Vietnam vets commit suicide than died in Vietnam. Why? Because the game didn't make sense.
Well, it's because the war didn't make sense.
Okay, the game. The war didn't make sense.
Yeah, but I don't accept the premise that war is a game.
I agree that men are innately competitive. I do see that very much in the school situation. But you look at the Olympics. Is it all men in the Olympics? No. There's
women are
there.
innately
so
competitive too.
Women
they
can be
compete
competitive
about
too.
beauty
Yeah.
often.
Adam, let me get you on this. Competition, winning, losing, boot camps, still good for boys?
I think competition is definitely good, but the difference that I would see in the discussion of whether war is a game or not is, as you said, you choose to play a game. Many men have not gotten to choose to go to war. They've had that obligation forced upon them over the generations, and that's one of many issues that men have had to face. So men forced to go...
Not anymore. Not in Canada or the United States
not in
anymore.
Canada, or the United States anymore. They still have to register. There's no more draft. But for the men who had to go fight in Vietnam, because many did, like Muhammad Ali was obviously a huge controversy when he avoided going to fight, and so that was his own game that he chose. But for those who didn't get a choice and had to go overseas and get shot or come back and then die later on from a game, from the results of a game that they didn't choose to play, I would not consider war a game, but I do consider competition good. I always strove better in school when I had a sense of accomplishment, or spelling bees where, hey, we're all competing to see who can spell words the longest. No one dies, but we're all competing. And whether a guy or a girl wins, it's still the competition that's good.
Did the boys compete as hard as, or, excuse me, other way around. Did the girls compete as hard in those spelling bees as the boys?
I would say they did.
They absolutely did, right?
My grade 4 teacher used to have us stand on our desks, and then when we would get down, so we were kind of standing above everyone too, to show, hey, we're still in the competition, we're still winning. And then when you spelled a word wrong, you had to get back down in your seat.
Huh. You want in on this?
I don't see any of these stereotypes represented in my life at all. I don't see the men being more competitive than women. To say that women are only competitive about beauty is really terribly condescending.
He didn't say only. He didn't say only.
Only is a key word there.
Yeah. I work in the arts where women are very well represented. I would say as well represented as men, and in many areas more represented than men. And I see everybody engaging in equally competitive and intellectual behaviors. And that, to me, is a very pleasant place to be. It's a place I would like to see the rest of society try to emulate. I don't know why we are worrying about perpetuating gender differences.
There was a recent study that was done on Facebook communications. There's 75,000 young men and 75,000 young women. And one of the things the researchers did was make a Wordle. And a Wordle is this little graphic design that shows you what the 100 most common words were, with the biggest words represented the most commonly used word. The most common word used by the girls was shopping. 75,000 young women. Okay.
Yeah, but
now many of the men and
women are different. The question is, do they have to be? I mean, we keep coming back to this issue.
What do you mean, do they have to be? Who says that? I don't know if they have to be. I'm willing to let them be.
Right.
Sorry, what was the? Can I find out what was the most common word?
Most
of the men?
them had to do with games.
So shopping for women, games for men.
Yeah, and a lot of it was video related.
You're happy to leave those distinctions and those roles exactly as they are. But they're obviously not left up to individuals. They're left up to society.
It's not obvious.
Has pressures.
It's not obvious that they're not
this
left
way.
to individuals, especially in egalitarian societies. They may be.
And you think this society is totally egalitarian?
No, I think that the Scandinavian countries are the most egalitarian countries, and that's where the biggest gender differences are. Not only in personality, but also in job choice. And I think it's hilarious that the number one word that the girls picked was shopping. And I think it's because women were gatherers in evolutionary history.
Michael, come on in.
The frequency of the word shopping has its roots in being gatherers in prehistory, but it is fueled by corporate capitalism. When girls choose shopping, they are the product of their culture, which tells them from birth, your job is to buy, buy, buy. So when we see that word come out on top, is that gender? Is it corporate capitalism? And I think that's a critique we have to make.
Women spend most of the consumer dollar. Men make more money on average, but women spend more money.
They are not completely free. They are the products of a culture. They are products of a consumer culture.
I don't normally ask this question at the end of a discussion, and we're down to our last minute and a half here, but did we resolve anything tonight?
Well, we don't think we're obsolete.
We don't think
I don't think I'm obsolete anyways.
I think we scratched the surface of how complex and how much nuance there is in this, and you know, that we have as many opportunities going forward as we do things to lose.
And we have also fallen quite often into generalizations. Mm-hmm. And I think the discussion is always hampered by generalizations, and we must always focus on the individual. Our boys, our sons, our daughters, who are you? What do you need? Apart from gender stereotypes, who are you, boy? Who are you, girl? And if we stayed with the individuals in our lives, a lot of these generalizations, which poison us, we could get rid of.
Adam?
I would say that we need to be having conversation that includes men and boys as well as women. So when the Canadian Association for Equality recently bumped heads with Ryerson that felt they need to center women's voice in discussions of gender, I don't think that's right. I think we should give both people credence and center men and women's voices and create a dialogue.
I'll give you the last 20 seconds. If you don't say anything too provocative, that'll get him back in.
I don't spend any time worrying about what it is to be a man. I am not terribly worried at all about being a man.
Do you think you're obsolete?
No, I'm a useful person.
I think the five of you agree on that. We have found the consensus. Good of all of you to join us tonight for a most interesting discussion. Michael Rice, the author of Raising Boys in a New Kind of World, Adam McPhee from the Canadian Alliance for Equality. Canadian Association for Equality, thank you for the fix. Todd Minerson from the White Ribbon Campaign, Jordan Peterson, clinical psychologist, University of Toronto, Russell Smith, you can read him in the Globe and Mail. Thanks, everybody, very much.
Thanks, Steve.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.